The dust came first, then the sound boots on dry earth, a wagon creaking somewhere beyond the ridge, the low impatient snort of a horse that had been standing too long in the sun. She stood at the edge of the ranch like someone waiting to be turned away, hands folded tight at her waist, dress faded thin enough to show where it had been mended again and again. The sky stretched endlessly blue, indifferent to hunger and pride, and the land around her looked hard enough to break bones and spirits both. She had walked 2 days to get here, rationing her breath the way she'd rationed her last crust of bread, rehearsing the words over and over so they wouldn't crack when she finally said them out loud. When the cowboy came into view, leading a horse with one hand and a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, she nearly lost her nerve. He looked like the land itself, broad, weathered, unyielding. His hat shadowed his eyes, but she felt their weight on her the moment he noticed her. Standing there, he didn't rush. Men like him never did. He stopped a few paces away, long enough to make her feel small, long enough to decide something she couldn't see, then waited. The silence pressed in until her chest hurt. "Please take me," she said finally, the words tumbling out raw and unpolished. Her voice shook, but she didn't lower her gaze. "I'll work for free." She expected laughter, or worse, that blank look men gave when a woman's need became inconvenient. Instead, he studied her the way one studies a storm cloud on the horizon, measuring danger, possibility, consequence. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and he watched it brush her cheek. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, voice low, worn smooth by years of dust and decisions. She swallowed. "I know exactly what I'm asking." He glanced past her, toward the open road she'd come from, then back at her again. "This place isn't kind. Neither is anywhere else." The truth of it sat between them like a third presence. He shifted his weight, boots grinding into the dirt, and for a moment she thought he might tell her to turn around. Instead, he said, "What's your name?" Relief nearly buckled her knees. "Clara." He nodded once, as if committing it to memory. "I'm Jonah." He didn't offer his hand. He didn't smile. But he stepped aside and gestured toward the ranch. "You can stay, for now." She followed him past the fence line, heart pounding, knowing that for now was the closest thing to mercy she was likely to get. The ranch unfolded like a place that had learned to survive without apology. Weathered buildings, fences repaired, with whatever had been on hand, land scarred by years of stubborn labor. Clara kept her head down and her pace steady, noting everything, learning the rhythm before anyone thought to test her. For weakness, Jonah spoke little as he showed her where she could sleep, where water was drawn, where work began before the sun bothered to rise. "You eat when the work's done," he said, not unkindly, not gently either. She nodded. She would have worked through the night for a crust. The first day broke her open in ways she hadn't expected. Her hands blistered, her back screamed, and more than once she tasted blood where she'd bitten down to keep from crying out. Still, she didn't stop. She sensed eyes on her other hands, other souls measuring her worth by the way she carried pain. Jonah watched too, from a distance, saying nothing. That silence was heavier than any criticism. By midday, the heat pressed down like judgment, and when her knees finally gave, she caught herself on a fence post and forced herself upright again. "You don't have to prove anything," came Jonah's voice behind her. She turned, surprised by how close he was. Sweat streaked his face. Dust clung to his sleeves. "I do," she said simply. Something shifted in his expression, then not pity, but recognition. He handed her a canteen without comment and walked away. That night, she lay on a thin mattress staring at the ceiling, every muscle aflame, wondering how long for now would last. She dreamed of running, of being chased, of doors closing just as she reached them. In the morning, she woke before the others and went back to work. Days stacked on days. Her hands hardened, her movements sharpened. She learned when to speak and when silence was safer. Jonah spoke more to her than to anyone else, though it was still spare instructions, warnings. The occasional question asked as if it mattered what she thought. Sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, his gaze unreadable. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, he found her repairing a broken gate long after the others had stopped. "Why'd you really come here?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. The truth was a fragile thing. "Because nowhere else would have me," she said at last. He considered that. "You're wrong," he said quietly. She almost laughed. "You don't know the places I've been." His jaw tightened. "Maybe I do." The storm came without warning, the sky darkening like a bruise, wind tearing across the land with sudden fury. Animals panicked, fences groaned, and Jonah's voice cut through the chaos, steady and commanding. Clara ran where she was told, heart hammering, rain soaking her to the bone within minutes. Lightning split the sky, thunder crashing close enough to feel in her chest. When a section of fencing collapsed, she and Jonah fought it together. Hands raw, bodies straining, the world narrowed to survival and shared effort. At one point, she slipped in the mud and he caught her, arms iron around her waist, holding her upright. For a heartbeat, they stayed like that, breath mingling, rain plastering her hair to her face. Something unspoken passed between them, acknowledgement, respect, a spark neither was ready to name. He released her gently, almost reluctantly. After the storm, exhaustion settled heavy over the ranch. Clara stood under the eaves, shivering, when Jonah draped a coat over her shoulders without a word. It was worn and warm and smelled faintly of leather and smoke. "Thank you," she said, voice barely more than breath. He nodded, eyes dark. "You didn't quit," he said. It wasn't praise. It was fact. Later that night, as the ranch slept, Jonah sat alone on the porch, turning a memory over in his mind. Another woman, years ago, standing in the same dust, asking for a chance, leaving behind a wound that had never quite healed. Clara lay awake too, staring into the darkness, wondering why his approval felt like something she'd been starving for far longer than food. The storm had passed, but something else had settled in its wake, something restless and dangerous, and alive, and though neither of them said it aloud, both felt the same quiet, terrifying thought take root. This wasn't just a temporary mercy anymore. This was the beginning of something that could either save them or ruin them both. Morning came sharp and cold, the kind that slipped into bones and reminded everyone on the ranch that mercy was never guaranteed. Clara rose before the bell, Jonah's coat folded neatly beside her, its weight lingering even after she'd returned it. She worked harder that day, not because she was watched, but because something inside her had shifted. She belonged to the rhythm now, the scrape of tools, the low voices at dawn, the quiet understanding that survival here was earned daily. Jonah noticed the change. He noticed everything, though he rarely named it. He gave her more responsibility without discussion, trusting her with tasks that required judgment, not just strength. That trust felt heavier than any burden she'd carried before, but trust bred closeness, and closeness stirred things Jonah had spent years burying. He found himself listening for her footsteps, watching the way she moved with the confidence of someone who had learned pain, but refused to kneel to it. One evening, a man rode in from town, bringing news wrapped in dust and trouble. Word traveled fast out here, too fast sometimes. Jonah heard Clara's name spoken in a way that made his jaw tighten. The man spoke of a woman matching her description, asking for work across counties, leaving quietly, carrying more than she arrived with, theft, deceit, survival, dressed up as crime. Jonah didn't confront her right away. He watched. He waited. Clara felt the tension before she understood it, sensed the distance in his silence, the way his eyes searched her now, not for effort, but for truth. When he finally spoke, it was after sundown, the land washed gold and red. "There are things you didn't tell me," he said. She froze, then slowly turned. "There are things no one ever asked." His voice hardened. "I'm asking now." Her chest tightened. Running had always been easier than staying, but she stayed. "I took food," she said. "Once, twice. I never hurt anyone. That's not the point." It was the point. "To me," she snapped, then softened. "I was starving." Jonah looked away, the memory of another woman flickering behind his eyes. "I've been lied to before," he said. "And I paid for it?" Clara nodded, understanding dawning painfully. "So you'll send me away?" It wasn't a question. Silence stretched. Then he said, "No." Her breath hitched. "But if you stay honest." She met his gaze, eyes bright with something fierce. "I already am." Trouble didn't Wait for forgiveness to settle. It arrived in the form of riders one afternoon. Dust clouds rising like warnings. Men with questions. Men with guns worn smooth by use. They asked about Clara, about a woman who worked for free. Jonah stood between them and her without hesitation. His presence a quiet promise of violence if pushed. Clara watched him from the porch, heart pounding, realizing for the first time that someone was willing to risk something for her. The men left. Unconvinced but cautious, the ranch exhaled. That night, Clara confronted Jonah beneath a sky crowded with stars. You didn't have to do that, she said. He didn't look at her. Yes, I did. She stepped closer. Why? He finally faced her, something raw in his eyes. Because I know what it costs to walk away when you should have stayed. The space between them felt electric, charged with everything unsaid. She saw his restraint, the way he held himself back like a man standing at the edge of a cliff. I won't run, she said quietly, even if you ask me to. His breath shuddered. For a moment, he looked like he might touch her, like he might finally close the distance. Instead, he turned away. Get some rest. The restraint hurt more than rejection. Days passed under that strain, work becoming a refuge from feeling. Then the accident happened. A horse spooked, a rope snapped, and Clara was thrown hard against the corral. Pain exploded white-hot. Jonah reached her first, lifting her with a gentleness that betrayed his fear. Blood streaked her temple. Stay with me, he said, voice breaking for the first time she'd heard. In that moment, his walls collapsed. As she drifted in and out, she felt his hand gripping hers like an anchor. Felt the truth settle deep. She mattered, not as labor, not as charity, as herself. She woke to lamplight and the sound of Jonah breathing nearby. He sat beside her bed, head in his hands. Shoulders slumped like the weight of years had finally caught up to him. When she stirred, his head snapped up. Relief crossed his face unguarded. You scared me, he said. She managed a weak smile. Guess I'm not that easy to get rid of. He laughed once, rough and quiet. Then his expression sobered. I've been waiting, he said slowly, for someone who stays. Someone who doesn't leave when it gets hard. Her heart raced. I've been waiting, she replied, for someone who sees me as more than what I owe. The truth hung there, fragile and bright. He reached for her hand, this time not letting go. Outside, the ranch settled into night, unchanged and yet entirely different. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. The promise was stronger than that, spoken not with lips, but with choice. By morning, Clara would walk the land not as a woman begging for shelter, but as someone who had claimed her place. Jonah would stand beside her, no longer haunted by what he'd lost, but steadied by what he'd found. And though the world beyond, the ranch still held danger, hunger, and judgment, they faced it together now to scarred souls who had finally stopped running, and in doing so, found exactly what they'd been waiting for. Recovery was slower than Clara wanted. Her body healed in stubborn stages, pain lingering like a reminder that survival always demanded payment. Jonah tried not to hover, but he stayed close, adjusting the work, assigning her tasks that kept her moving without breaking her again. The ranch noticed the change between them long before either spoke it aloud. Silence had shifted into something warmer, heavier. A shared glance lasted longer than necessary. A hand lingered when passing tools, yet peace never lasted long out here. Word returned from town like a bad echo. Someone was still asking questions. Not about theft this time, but about Jonah. Old debts, old blood. Clara overheard just enough to know the danger was real. One night, she confronted him as he cleaned his gun by lantern light. What aren't you telling me? She asked. Jonah's jaw tightened. Things I thought were buried. He finally spoke then, voice low, revealing. A past shaped by betrayal, a brother lost to violence, a deal gone wrong that had marked him as a man who owed more than money. Clara listened without interrupting, understanding settling painfully into her bones. They'll come here, she said. They already are. Jonah looked at her, really looked, as if weighing a decision that terrified him. I won't have you paying for my mistakes. You won't decide that for me. Her voice didn't shake. That was when he realized she wasn't asking for protection anymore. She was choosing him. The riders came at dawn. Not many, enough. The air snapped tight with tension as they rode up slow, confident, knowing exactly who they were looking for. Jonah stepped forward, hand loose at his side. Eyes steady, Clara stood behind him, not hiding, not fleeing. The men spoke of debts, of consequences long overdue. Jonah didn't deny them. He simply said, "Not like this, not here." One man laughed. Another glanced at Clara with something like curiosity. That was the mistake. When the first shot rang out, the ranch erupted into chaos. Horses screamed, dust rose, and time fractured into sharp, violent moments. Clara moved without thinking, dragging a fallen hand to cover, firing only when she had to. She wasn't fearless, she was resolved. When the dust finally settled, the riders were gone, retreated, or carried away. Jonah stood bleeding, but upright. Clara ran to him, hands trembling as she pressed cloth to his wound. "You stayed," he breathed. "I told you," she said fiercely. In that moment, the cost of love was no longer theoretical. It was blood and pain and choice. Healing came again, slower this time, deeper. The ranch bore new scars, but it still stood. Jonah recovered with Clara at his side. The past no longer a shadow, but a chapter finally closed. One evening, as the land glowed gold and quiet, Jonah took her to the far edge of the property where the earth opened wide and honest. "I once thought waiting meant hiding," he said. "Turns out it meant becoming someone worth staying for." Clara smiled, eyes bright with everything they'd survived. "I once thought asking for less was safer," she replied. "Turns out asking for everything is how you live." He reached for her then, not in desperation, but in certainty. The kiss was slow, earned, steady as the land beneath them. She had arrived asking for work. She had stayed for truth. And now she stood beside him, not because she was taken in, but because she was chosen and chose back. The ranch settled into night, no longer just a refuge, but a future. And if the world beyond still held danger, they were ready now. Waiting was over. Living had begun. The land remembered everything. Every bootstep, every drop of blood, every promise spoken into the dust. In the weeks that followed the gunfight, the ranch moved with a quieter purpose. As if it too were healing, repairs were made slowly, deliberately, not rushed by fear anymore. Clara woke each morning to the same wide sky, but she stood differently. Beneath it now, shoulders squared, breath steady, no longer measuring her worth by how little she asked for. Jonah watched her without hiding it, not as a guardian, not as a rescuer, but as a man standing beside a woman who had chosen the same ground he had. They spoke more now. Not just of work, but of small things, where the fence should be moved, how the creek ran higher in spring, what the land might become if cared for long enough. At night, they shared silence that felt full instead of empty. There were still scars, his limp when the weather turned, her pause when voices rose too suddenly, but they didn't flinch away from them. Pain had become something acknowledged, not denied. One afternoon, Clara rode the far boundary alone. Something Jonah would never have allowed months before. When she returned at dusk, dust-covered and steady, he nodded once. The unspoken trust between them felt like the strongest thing either had ever known. Change came not as threat this time, but as opportunity. Word spread that Jonah's land was steady, defended, fair. A family passed through looking for work, then another. The ranch grew not in size, but in spirit. Clara took on more responsibility, teaching others the same lessons she'd learned the hard way. Don't rush the land. Don't lie to the people beside you. Don't mistake survival for living. Jonah found himself stepping back, letting her lead where her instincts were sharper than his. There was no jealousy in it, only relief. One evening, beneath a sky heavy with stars, Jonah finally spoke the question he'd been carrying. "You came here with nothing," he said. "You could leave with everything you need. Why stay?" Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at the land, the lights in the windows, the quiet proof of what they'd built. "Because this is the first place that didn't ask me to disappear," she said. He reached for her hand then, calloused fingers fitting easily with hers. There was no drama in it, just truth. The kind that lasts. The day Jonah asked her to stand with him wasn't marked by ceremony. No crowd, no speeches, just the two of them at the center of the land that had tested them both. "I once thought strength meant standing alone," he said. Turns out it means knowing who you stand with. Clara smiled, not the desperate smile of a woman asking for mercy, but the steady one of someone who had earned her place. I once said I'd work for free. She replied softly. Turns out I was paying my way toward a life. They stood there as the wind moved through the grass, the past finally quiet. She had arrived asking to be taken in. She stayed because she was seen. And now she wasn't waiting for permission, shelter, or survival anymore. She was home. The land stretched out before them, unfinished, demanding. Alive just like the future they chose together. And for the first time, neither of them feared. What came next? Waiting was no longer part of their story. Building was.